And welcome to Unit 14, Module 75. We're talking about conformity and obedience today. Here are your learning objectives, and here is your vocab. So let's talk about automatic mimicry. So animals and humans tend to go with what the group does, and this is sometimes called the chameleon effect. So when I say automatic, that means without really conscious awareness. It's something we do implicitly. If someone yawns or laughs or coughs even, they look at their phone, all of these things we tend to mimic without conscious awareness. If someone starts speaking in a sad sounding voice, that might make us feel sad, right? We have those mirror neurons that help us imitate and feel what other people are feeling. This can be a good thing, but it can also be harmful depending on what the person is doing that we are mimicking. So mimicry is a type of conformity. And conformity is the adjusting of our behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standard. Now, conformity isn't something that someone is telling you have to do. It's not an obey authority type thing. It is something that we do on our own to be with the group, to be accepted by the group. So we're more likely to conform under different circumstances. If we feel insecure, if we are in a group of 3 or more, if everyone else agrees, we're more likely to agree and not be the dissenter. If we really respect or admire the group's status, and if we are from a culture that really strongly encourages respect for social standards, we're more likely to conform. So Solomon Asch did a famous study in 1955 where he had participants take what they thought was a visual perception test. He would sit them down at a table, and there would be about 4 other people who were sitting there with this person, and he would show them a picture of a line, like in the top right here. And then he would show them another set of lines, and he would say, which number line matches the original line? Now, this was a very easy question, and the answer is very obvious, right? For example, in this case, it's number 3. But that's not really what the experiment was about. What it was about was, will the person conform even when they know the answer is wrong? The answer the group is giving is wrong. So how he set this up was he had only one real participant in every grouping. So when you sat down at the table and there were a number of other people answering the same question, really those other people were in on the experiment. They're known as Confederates. Anyone who is in on the experiment is a Confederate. So at first those Confederates were saying the right answer. 3, 3, 3, right? And they do a couple more of these line questions, and they would give the correct answer. Almost like, okay, this is so boring, it's easy, whatever. But then they start giving an incorrect answer. So they all start saying 2, right? And they all go down the line and say 2. And now it's your turn, the participant, and you look at it really closely and you maybe question yourself, and maybe you think they see something that you don't see, or you know they're wrong, but you don't feel comfortable. So what does that person do? That's what Asch was studying. And it turns out that more than 1/3 of the participants gave the wrong answer in order to conform to the group. Now, obviously, that's not most of the people, but still, when you see how obvious that what the right answer is, it's still shocking to realize that many people would do that. So why do we do this? Well, we want to follow a social norm. We want to gain socially. We want to gain social. So a person has a desire to gain approval or avoid disapproval. That is the normative social influence. So we feel this need to belong, as Maslow has said. And we want to do the thing that helps us belong. So that pushes us to conform. If we are different and we go against the grain, that can make people perhaps not like us or think that we're weird or whatever. So there are consequences to not following the norms. Now, we can also have informational social influence, and that is when we gather information that we didn't know by looking around us. So if we walk right up to the food at the table, and then we stop and we kind of look around and we realize that, whoa, there's this line and everyone's in line, and I didn't know, but I guess we have to form a line over here to get this food. So that would be informational social influence. Like, oh, everyone's doing this thing. Oops, maybe that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. So obedience. So let's look at Milgram's experiment, which was on obedience. And this was conducted after Ashes. It was in 1963 originally. And he had participants believe they were shocking someone at higher and higher voltages to see how long they would obey an authority figure. Now, important to note before I get into this, no one was shocked in this experiment. That was a setup, right? Because he also used Confederates, people that were in on the experiment. So those people pretended that they were receiving high voltage shocks, but they were not. So he conducted this on nearly 1,000 people in 20 different experiments. They were all men aged 20 to 50. And he conducted this originally at Yale University. So what happened? He had a participant who volunteered for what they thought was a learning experiment, but really it was about obedience. The participant and a Confederate, so a person who was in on the experiment, drew straws together. And one said they were going to be the teacher, and one said they were going to be a learner. Now, this was a setup. The participant was always going to be the teacher, because that was what he's testing, is obedience to authority figure. So the teacher was given these pairing words, and they'd have to read them off, and the student or the learner who was in on this had to give a correct answer. Every time they gave an incorrect answer, they would receive a shock. And the person who gave the shock was the participant, the teacher. So the participant would read off these paired terms, and the student would respond, and then if they were wrong, they had to push the button on this machine to give them the voltage. Now, if they got a question wrong a second time, the voltage would increase, etc., all the way up to 450 volts, where the machine read XXX, 450 volts. So the learner, as this kind of increased, would get upset, would complain of pain, and eventually went completely silent, possibly making the teacher think that something really went wrong, that they're not okay. I should mention the student is in a separate room. Sorry, I should have mentioned that at the beginning. So they can't see this person, they can only hear them. Now, at any moment, the teacher might say, he sounds like he's hurt, like maybe we should stop. And they would look over at that experimenter, and the experimenter would say one of two things. It is absolutely essential that you continue this experiment, or they might say, you have no other choice, you must go on. Now, we, as a third party, looking at this as a psych experiment, can easily say, you have a choice, you have an internal locus of control, and you can say no and not push that button, right? They can't force you to push that button. If they want to do it, they can do it. However, what this study shows us is how humans tend to behave, and how we tend to behave under an authority figure is we tend to listen to them regardless if it goes against our moral beliefs or attitudes. So over 60% fully complied all the way up to the last switch. When he did this experiment again, he added that the learner saying that they have a slight heart condition and they still had similar results. In 10 later studies, he used women and had similar results. So are today's people less likely to conform? According to the studies, there's a slight difference, but not much. Now, as individuals, we have self-serving bias where we like to say, oh, well, everyone else would do that, but I'm better than average, right? Self-serving bias. But the reality is put in these situations, we do tend to obey the authority figure. Some things that influence our obedience. Well, we're more likely to obey if the person is perceived as legitimate. So the lab coat, if they are from a prestigious institution such as Yale, they're more likely compared to when he did it at other institutions that were less prestigious. If the victim is depersonalized, so in another room, don't really know them, that makes it easier to obey. If there are no other role models who are showing defiance, then people are more likely to obey if everyone else is obeying, because in a way you're conforming, right? When you look at the Holocaust, that has an implication where people were obeying orders. People didn't feel necessarily right about it, or they felt they had moral issues with it, but they were obeying authority figure. If people were to dissent, both in the Milgram experiment and in the Holocaust, that happened early on. And then the people who stayed on were more likely to go all the way through. So what else have we learned from this? We know that there is a strong social influence on people, and that can lead them to do things that we consider evil. So when we look at people and we look at what they did, the end results of a whole bunch of situations, right? We should really look at the situations or the societal institutions that led to that point. How did that person end up doing that act? Let's look at all of the factors, not just that end point of that 450 volts. In society, great evils sometimes grow out of people's compliance with smaller things, right? So Milgram tried this experiment, and he had this one time he tried it, he had it so the participant did not push the button. They were a part of the experiment, they read the words, they were still the teacher, but they didn't have to push the button. When he did that, 93% of the people complied. So giving people some distance, but still be involved in possibly killing a man, makes people very compliant. So it's easier. Maybe there's less cognitive dissonance. So our takeaways. Remember that the chameleon effect and conformity, both of those things can help people if the right model is presented, but it can also be harmful. We are influenced by others for social gain, to be feelings of belonging. And Ash's experiment on conformity was about comparing lines, and Milgram's experiment was demonstrating obedience using a learning and shock experiment. So that sums up Module 75, and I will see you in class. Thanks, guys.